Hi, I'm Jeff Franke, Editorial Director of Manufacturing.net and Manufacturing Business Technology. Welcome to Security Breach. Believe it or not, there was a time in recent history when we actually experienced a reprieve in ransomware attacks. According to a report from Black Kite, a leading provider of third-party risk management and cyber intelligence, a number of factors contributed to a flattening of ransomware attack frequency in late 2021 and into 2022. The firm attributes this to increased pressure from law enforcement, operations specifically targeting ransomware groups, less insurance coverage, and a growing understanding that paying a ransom doesn't always lead to a satisfactory resolution for the victim. Unfortunately, the bad guys evolved, and ransomware attacks have surged in early 2023, with the number of ransomware victims in March of this year coming in at nearly twice that of April 2022 and 1.6 times higher than last year's highest monthly total. New players like Black Basta, as well as new strategies from well-known adversaries like LockBit, once again brought manufacturing to the top of the list of favorite targets. According to the report, manufacturing represented nearly 1 out of every 5 attacks, with companies reporting annual revenues of 50 to 60 million being the favorite amongst hackers. The report, which I can't recommend enough, cited the most common traits amongst victims as poor email configuration, credential leaks, public remote access ports, out-of-date systems, and IP addresses with botnet activity. Our guest for today's episode is ready to offer some insight on these new types of attacks and how you can prevent them from extorting your company. Before we talk to our guest for this episode, we're excited to announce that Security Breach is being sponsored by Pentera. For more information on their cybersecurity solutions, you can go to pentera.io. It's now my pleasure to introduce Jeremy Wheatman, a cyber risk evangelist at Black Kite, to Security Breach. He's going to discuss, among other things, their Ransomware Resurgence 2023 report. Jeffrey, thanks so much for joining us today and welcome to Security Breach. I thought to get things rolling, we could jump right into the report. It was excellent. There was a ton of great information in there. And I was just kind of wondering, what were some of the highlights for you? Was there some things that really stood out in a chance to review it?
Yeah, so thanks very much for having me on today. I love doing these kinds of things. I think there were a couple of things that to me jumped out. At the end of last year, we saw a drop in ransomware, and I think people thought maybe we were sort of good. And then we saw a huge spike right after New Year's. And I think that's going to be the norm. I think the drop in like kind of November, December, I think was an anomaly. So that I think was interesting. Another one was the fact that mid-sized companies seem to be the biggest targets, like, 50, 60, 70 million dollars. And we can definitely talk about that through the conversation. And then the other one, which maybe not surprising, but was that manufacturing represented a fairly significant percentage, like over 15% of the ransomware attacks were at manufacturing. And I think those are interesting. There's one other thing too that I'll bring up in a few minutes, but one of the things we talked about in advance was any trends, and there's actually a new ransomware gang that we just put a report out on that. We definitely want to talk about that a little bit.
Excellent. Well, you mentioned manufacturing. That's who we're talking about here, the industrial sector. And I think they did come in as the most highly targeted industrial, or the most highly targeted segment. Something like 19.5% of all reported ransomware attacks were focused on manufacturing or the industrial sector. When you look at those attacks, is there anything that's unique about the tactics or the approach or the vulnerabilities that are exploited when it comes to the industrial sector versus a different type of business?
So it's a great question. I think really it's more about the defensive posture than it is about the attacks. I mean, let's face it, right? We've been around a while, and the bad actors they're using vulnerabilities that are not new in most cases. They're using stuff that's been around, and people just don't do a great job protecting themselves. They don't have great process. They don't do a good job patching. They're not protecting their data. They're not protecting their endpoints. And I think, as you know, because you're in this space, manufacturing has, I think the focus hasn't really been on cyber for a long time. And I think we're now seeing the ramifications of that lack of focus.
Absolutely. Well, you brought them up. I definitely want to dive in a little bit. You talked about patchwork management and endpoint security were two things that were specifically called out in the report. Let's maybe tackle them one at a time here. What can we talk about when it comes to patchwork management? Why is that so critical?
Yeah, so patching is basically the process of deploying a small piece of software to fix some vulnerability that has been discovered in the code base or in the way data is handled. And, there are hundreds of these things every month. So patch management is really developing a process for identifying which ones are relevant to you, prioritizing them because they're not all as bad as others. They're not all as easy to exploit as others. And then coming up with a consistent way to get those patches deployed. And here's one of the key things, and I think this is an area that people don't focus enough on, is what is an appropriate time frame? Do you want to get them out in 7 days? Do you want to get them out in 14, 21, 30? And there are balancing acts that need to take place there. The quicker you get them out, the more it costs either human capital or tooling. The longer it takes to get them out, the more exposed you are. So really just building a program around threat and vulnerability management. And, I've been in security for 25 years, and this is a problem that we've had pretty much since I first started. And there's just not a lot of great solutions out there other than, buckling down and building a scalable, repeatable process.
Yeah. One of the things that we've heard about, maybe you disagree, but when it comes to the patches, they almost become a crutch. People wait for the patch to come out, figure that's sort of the response to fixing everything if it gets out of date. What are your feelings there in terms of managing them and utilizing these patches, but maybe not becoming overly reliant upon them to meet up with the evolving needs of your security?
Yeah, patch management is an important thing, but there are tons of other things that you need to put in there. Things like multi-factor authentication, things like data encryption, things like detection and response. Uh, you should be patching, but nobody, period, full stop, nobody ever gets all their patches out. It's just not a practical thing. So you have to have balance in your environment. And that's why in our platform, as an example, we have 19 categories of controls that we look at. Patch management is one of them. It's an important one. But there are so many other things: managing your applications, managing your user credentials, creating policy, compliance. There's just so many different things to look at that are complementary and sometimes compensatory. If you can't get your patches out, there are other things you can do to mitigate those risks in part, sometimes even in whole.
Sure. And then the other thing we're going to talk about is endpoint security. I think this is something in the industrial sector we've got an understanding of, but maybe it doesn't get the priority that it really should.
So I don't have the data in front of me, but at any given time, you always see a pretty significant percentage of breaches started with an endpoint. So in other words, someone's laptop or a mobile device got compromised, or a desktop, or maybe it's an industrial scanning station, in a manufacturing facility. And then from there, those users sort of hop off. So if you do a good job protecting those endpoints, you cut a lot of the attacks off sort of at the beginning before they're able to get in. And I think that the platforms, the tools that do endpoint protection, I think are really mature. And it's just a matter of getting those things out and back to the process about making sure that you have a scalable, repeatable way of getting them out. But these things, they encompass anti-spam, antivirus, anti-worm, encryption. Sometimes they're looking at data flowing back and forth. And these platforms are relatively low overhead, fairly easy to manage from a centralized console. And I think they cut down the attack surface essentially. And nobody gets 100% done again. So the more you get, the less sort of vectors or access points the bad actors are going to be able to come from.
Yeah. In manufacturing, we struggle a lot with the connection points. We're taking a lot of times legacy systems or legacy technology and connecting it to something new. When we talk about endpoint security, this stuff isn't rocket science. These are pretty straightforward measures that can be taken to make sure you're safe and secure at this point, correct?
Yeah, but to your point about manufacturing, there are a lot of legacy pieces of hardware and software that are deployed throughout a lot of your listeners and your readers. And even as I'm a professional paranoid, that's how I refer to myself. And I always tell people, I can't in good conscience tell you have to rip something out at the cost of hundreds of millions of dollars because you can't secure it. So that's why layered security is so important. That's why looking at all these other things. Now, one thing we've seen, and it sort of ebbed and flowed a little bit, but over the last few years is more of a convergence of OT, operational technology, and IT. And I think that's been a little bit scary because now a lot of those older systems that can't be patched, can't be locked down, things are hard coded. They're now on the same network as a lot of the IT infrastructure. And I think the bad actors are salivating when they see that stuff because they know it's an easy pop for them.
Well, and maybe you could go into it a little bit. I agree 100%. We've been talking about this a lot. But from the hacker's perspective, why do they get excited when they see all of that basically under one umbrella? Because, I mean, I get it, but maybe just from a hacker's perspective, what are they seeing and why does that get them excited?
Yeah, so, water rolls downhill. People want to take the easy way out. If I'm an attacker and I'm going after an organization that doesn't have endpoint protection, doesn't have patching, has really old legacy systems with, embedded issues in them, it's an easier win for me than having to, go after an organization where they're doing all of the basic blocking and tackling and some advanced things. Let's face it, attackers, just like everyone else, have a tendency to be lazy. If they can win by trying a lot less, then that's probably what they're going to do. And then I think the flip side to that, tying back to the ransomware report that we talked about at the very beginning, I think they know a lot of those companies are going to pay the ransom because for them, it's an operational dependency. Yeah, there's data, no doubt. But if you're in manufacturing, it costs $1 million, $10 million, $50 million a day if your systems are out. And sometimes it's just easier. Well, we can pay $5 million in ransom versus losing $50 million because we're going to be down for 10 days. That's pretty much a slam dunk of a description. And again, the attackers are in it for the money, right? Willie Sutton, the famous bank robber, they asked him why he robbed banks. And he said, because that's where the money is. The bad guys, they're going where the money is. They're going where they're going to get paid. They're going where it's going to be easier for them.
Well, I think it's interesting, too, because one of the things that we talk about in the industrial sector is this siloed approach that's always taken place between IT and OT and getting those folks to work together more. But just to distinguish the difference, we're not saying converge the data. We're just saying converge the know-how and the understanding. Because obviously taking some of those IT hacks and getting into the IT system, that's a lot different from a response approach than from the OT side of things.
Yeah. The other thing, too, is that a lot of the companies that are manufacturing OT devices, well, they want to be able to manage them remotely. And the only way to do that is to put them on the network. So while the tools may not be converging, the highway, the roads that all that stuff rides on, that's absolutely converging. And I think that's just going to get worse. Those folks, they don't want to fly out to your plant to fix stuff. They want to be able to type in and do it remotely. Right. So they're going to leave those exposures. And I can tell you from experience when I was in consulting and when I was in my last role at Gartner, we would talk to people who their remote service providers had zero operational security. They had these wide open connections that were then accessible via third party, fourth party, nth party, coming in from the outside.
That is scary. Another thing that's a little frightening is some of the new threat actors that you talked about in the report. Who are some of the ones, either their tactics or the organizations themselves, that are sort of lighting up your radar right now?
Yeah, so I think there's been a seismic shift, I think is probably not an understatement, in ransomware. So it used to be the bad guys would come in and they would encrypt your data and you would have to pay them. Well, then they went from, hey, we could steal the data, then we're going to encrypt it. And then if you don't pay, not only do you not have your data, but we're going to release it. And now we're seeing sort of a third iteration which is we're going to steal your data. We're going to release it. And by the way, we're going to tell all your partners where we got it from in the first place. So now you have this sort of extended thing, right? We're also seeing an uptick in what is called encryptionless ransomware, which is ransomware, rather than going after the data, it goes after the systems and makes them unusable. So, for example, they don't have to encrypt my email if they keep me from using email in the first place, right? Yeah. And then the other thing, so we actually just released a paper on this new ransomware gang called Malus Locker, and they're going after a software package called Zimbra. Now, what's interesting about this group is they're not actually collecting ransom. What they're saying is, we want you to donate money to a charity of your choice at your level of comfort based on your revenue. Send us a proof that you did that, and we'll give you your systems back. And as we know, and this is not any kind of secret, a lot of the ransomware attack groups are coming out of Russia and that region. Well, this Malice Locker, 40% of their victims or 30% of their victims are in Russia. So there's like a little bit of a Robin Hood thing going on there, which is super interesting. And I think, generally speaking, LockBit, that's one of the ones that we see a lot of. A lot of the ransomware gangs that got kind of shut down from the crackdown at the end of last year, which is why those numbers went down, are now back and they have new names. One thing that I think is really interesting for your listeners to consider is these ransomware gangs are businesses. They are unicorn businesses, meaning they're worth $1 billion, and we don't have the capability to fight them. I actually it hasn't been delivered yet, but we're Farhat Dick Biak, who's our head of research, he and I did a presentation that's being delivered in June in a couple places called "Are Ransomware Gangs the New Unicorn Startups?" And they have salespeople, they have customer success teams, they have marketing, they have affiliate networks. They're figuring out who their targets are. It's not just spray and pray anymore. So it's the bad guys are getting much better, and we're getting better, but probably not as fast as they are.
That part has always intrigued me, and we can appreciate, we've talked about how complex these organizations are, but if they're getting to the point now where they again have that type of infrastructure from a people perspective, what do you think is drawing more people to want to go to these black hat organizations instead of coming to work on the good side? Because, man, we need them badly. There are so many job openings right now in cybersecurity. People could have their pick. So what do you think is drawing them more to that side?
I think part of the reason is money. I think they probably are getting paid more money. One thing that I see, and I spend a lot of time on Reddit, and there are groups on there, saying, I need a job. I have a resume. Everyone's telling me I'm underqualified. So so-called entry-level positions in security are not really entry-level. You have to have some other background before you can just jump in, right? No one's graduating and going right in there. I think that the other challenge is the supply and demand problem. Security people at this point in time command more money. And I don't think a lot of HR firms and a lot of financial folks understand we got to pay 25% more for someone with the same level of expertise. I think also some of the bad actors don't like the structure of working in corporate environments. Right. I have not been for a couple of years, but I've been a DEF CON goon for years. So working at DEF CON out in Vegas. And, I work with people who have made that transition, and pretty much across the board, they all say the same thing. I went from being able to do stuff that I was interested in to being forced to do stuff that other people are interested in. So I think there's a cultural thing. And keep in mind, too, a lot of these ransomware gangs are not located in the United States. They're not necessarily located in Europe. They're in areas where there is not the same level of opportunity for skilled practitioners, or even unskilled practitioners, frankly.
No, that makes sense. You alluded to it before, and it's an interesting part of the report. When you talk about sort of the sweet spot in terms of who the hackers are targeting right now, it's that company that's $50 to $60 million in annual revenue. For the industrial sector and manufacturing, that is hundreds of thousands of targets of companies right now. What do you think it is? What are the dynamics there that make that such an appealing demographic to hit?
I think there are two pieces that sort of come together. One is those organizations will take a significant hit if they are hit with ransomware or any kind of a breach, really. And then at the other end, they have money, right? They can spend money to recover. A smaller company may just say, you know what? We're just going to burn it to the ground and start up again from scratch. But, bigger companies can't do that. And while manufacturing is certainly not my core expertise, my guess is those companies in that size, they are providing services and product for a lot of other companies downstream to them. They can't really afford to be out. And I think that that's the challenge. And then I also think the attackers know what we know, which is historically, there hasn't been a big focus on the technical side, on the cybersecurity side, on IT resilience in manufacturing. But the good news, it's definitely getting better. We, for example, at Black Kite, we are hearing a lot more from people in that area who are looking to understand, what is the cyber posture within our supply chain, both digital and physical supply chain. They're looking to understand what are the financial impacts if a key partner falls over, and what are our exposures there to help them prioritize where they should be focusing, because not all your partners are equal. I always badly paraphrase Animal Farm by George Orwell. All partners are equal, but some partners are more equal than others.
Yeah.
And we need to focus on the ones that are the most important and the most critical and the most risky.
No, that's reassuring to hear. Those supply chain pressures are very real. Just looking at some of the things that have made headlines lately, the Dole hack was a big one because of the different pressures they were feeling from retailers, from distributors, logistics companies that they're contracted with. They were basically just waiting for them to be able to go back alive and producing product for them to deliver and sell. So it's a great point. Staying with ransomware, I got to ask, with all these different dynamics and we see who the primary target is, for us, that's small to medium-sized manufacturers, when they're hit with these attacks, what advice do you give in terms of do you pay, do you not pay? What are your thoughts there?
Yeah, that's a really, really hard question. And I'm going to be careful about how I answer because I don't want to come across as giving legal advice. What I will tell you is it's a team decision, right? The board needs to be involved. The C-levels need to be involved. The business unit leaders, right? So the EVPs and the SVPs need to be involved. Your operations team needs to be involved. The security team needs to be involved. And you need to weigh and balance sort of, if you pay, they're going to come back because they know you paid, right? So that's one thing you can balance. And I'll just give you a quick story. So a cousin of mine, this is about a year and change ago, they got hit with ransomware and there were a lot of issues going on there. And they basically made a decision to chuck it, rebuild everything from scratch and not pay. And that is the decision that they made. One of the things from the paying perspective, and I'm not sure how much this is going to hit manufacturing, but we're seeing a lot of, or hearing a lot of, see murmurings. We're hearing murmurings that the federal government may put in regulations around financial services and insurance to not allow them to pay, right? Because you want to take the incentive away from the bad guys. But I got to be honest with you, if I am out of business, if I don't pay, I'm going to pay and deal with the negative consequences.
Yeah.
Right? There's an old military thing, right? I'd rather be yelled at by one than carried by six. And not that I served, but I think that's a challenge. And I think also keeping in mind, if you pay, they're going to come back because they know that you're an easy target and they know that you're willing to pony up. So it's a really hard question, though.
Well, it's a difficult situation for anyone to really understand how they're going to respond until they get hit, which is why, people like Black Kite can help them out a little bit. And you've talked a little bit about some of the things you've done. I can't recommend the 2023 Ransomware Resurgence Report enough. It's incredibly well done. But maybe you could tell us a little bit more about some of the stuff Black Kite is doing to help the good guys out.
Yeah. So prior to coming to Black Kite, I spent time at a major analyst firm. I was there for 15 years. I won't say that, but you can look me up on LinkedIn. And one of the things that I saw was that clients were really struggling with managing cyber risk in their third-party ecosystem, in what I call extended ecosystem. So there is a severe lack of visibility. Most organizations are sending out questionnaires maybe once every 2 or 3 years. And assuming the questionnaires are perfect, day one, by day 90, they're not. And by day 1,000, 3 years in, you can't count on their accuracy at all. Yeah. So we have the capability to actually provide real-time or near real-time visibility into, we have thousands of data sources and they're all combined into those 19 categories. There's a lot of vetting. We have very low false positive rates, so we're not running a fire drill and then you go, oh, that was a mistake. We also have an implementation of cyber risk quantification around data loss scenario. around the financial impact of ransomware in your supply chain, digital or physical, and business interruption. So we're covering essentially, data protection as well as availability. From the ransomware perspective, we have a trademark mechanism is called RSI, Ransomware Susceptibility Index. What we realized was, there are 298 controls, but only about 37 of them have anything to do with ransomware. So we look at those controls, not just individually, but how they work together. So as an example, if you have administrative ports open to the internet, we talked earlier about admin stuff, managing from the outside, that's bad. But if you have multi-factor authentication on the inside, it's less bad. And we look at all of those things and we score that on an index from 0 to 1. And essentially, it's a probabilistic assessment of how likely an organization is to be hit with ransomware. And talking about the report, and thank you for that, because we're super, super proud of that piece of work. But the vast majority, and I don't actually have the stat in front of me, but the vast majority, actually I do. 70% of the successful attacks, those people had an RSI above 0.4, which is above the average, and we have indices there. We also have some really cool stuff around what we call focus tags. So this Zimbra vulnerability that I just mentioned that Malware is going after, we already have the capability to find all of the instances of Zimbra in your extended ecosystem and tell you about it, because most people can't figure that part out. We do a lot of stuff around automation, super scalable. One of our customers is using us to monitor 80,000 entities within critical infrastructure as defined by the U.S. government. So really exciting. I mean, let's put it this way. People ask me why I left Gartner to come here. Ooh, I said it. People ask me why I left my former employer to come here. And I said, I believe in what we're doing. I think this is a huge problem that needs to be solved. There's no visibility. There's no continuous monitoring. There's no understanding of where your real risk exposures are. And, we're seeing things in concentration risk, too many eggs in one basket. We're seeing cascading risk, which is I do business with A, who does business with B, who does business with C, D, E, et cetera. Well, F, they stink at cyber. They get breached, and I can't get my product from A. Yeah. But I didn't agree to do business with F. But they're part of my business anyway.
No, the interconnectivity is a big part of it. And I love how you bring up the RSI score, because right now one of the biggest issues for those sort of at ground level, if you will, in trying to deal with cybersecurity issues is getting the funding they need from folks higher up on the food chain to attack these issues. The RSI essentially is a built-in ROI saying if you do these things, this is how much more safely you'll be able to protect your enterprise. So I love that part of it.
Yeah, and the other thing too that our platform is built on standards. So rather than you have a score because we got 2 thumbs and we say so, we have our entire scoring mechanism is all based on NIST and MITRE ATT&CK. So rather than having to go and so I go to my third party and I go, hey, you guys think it's security, and they say, well, according to whom? And you can say, well, according to NIST and MITRE, and here's a list of things that you could do that will significantly improve your posture and therefore improve my risk resilience as well. So it's a relationship that you need to have with all of your partners, as opposed to, I'm going to wag my finger at you, and if you don't get any better, I'm going to wag my finger very, very aggressively next time. And sometimes that's all you got. Right, that's the only weapon in your holster.
It's interesting. You bring up NIST. You've brought up the government a little bit and a couple of other talking points. What is your take here? Do we need more government involvement? We do have certain legislation that tells utilities and other critical infrastructure they need to be in touch with law enforcement when they are attacked. They need to give a heads up on ransomware attacks, things like that. But it's a very small segment of all the potential targets that are out there. Do we need government to keep doing what they have been doing, which is here's the guidelines, here's some things you should need to do. We're going to try to help you develop more training, better approaches, best practices, things like that? Or do they need to start regulating this and making people talk about and share this information when they're hit? What's your take on that?
Public-private partnership, that has been something that we've been talking about for years. What has historically been the problem is the government has been too much about, you better do this, or else, and nobody really wants to be told what to do. So we're seeing some shifts, and I'm gonna do a little bit of correction myself. I actually have a podcast that we've been doing as well called Risk and Reels, and we have an episode that is going to be going up shortly with Bailey Bickle. So Bailey runs the Cyber Collaboration Center for the Defense Industrial Base at the NSA, and that was the exact question I asked of her. What can we do better? And she said it's much more about, here's what we're seeing and here's how we're seeing people respond, as opposed to you better do this or else. Because first of all, smaller companies can't do these things. It's too expensive. So I think giving them opportunities, and then, and here's the thing, and this may not be a popular thought, but I think that if the government really wants to have an impact, and they go to people and people come and say, well, we can't do this, can you help us? They should be able to provide the tools and the capabilities and the technology. And that's been lacking. Now, one thing also to point out, the most recent cybersecurity strategy out of the White House, which came out back in March, I think maybe beginning of April, there's a big section on private-public partnership. But it's not new. And I think we need to change the way we've been going about it. That's why I think the Cyber Collaboration Center at the NSA is such a good idea. But the other thing too, the government needs to give all of your listeners the capability to talk amongst themselves without the government listening in. And partially it's a problem because some of the folks in your cadre, they're competitors with each other and they don't want to talk about it, right? So I think we need to help them understand. One thing that I learned when I was at my last role was it's okay to tell people there's a problem without giving them a solution, for the purpose of helping everyone understand we all have this problem. You don't want to think you're alone, because I think a lot of people think they're the only ones. God, like, I haven't been able to figure this out. Well, you know what? Nobody's been able to figure it out. Why don't we put our heads together and figure out, what little steps can we take to improve? I think there's a tendency, and this may be a uniquely American thing. I think there's a tendency to look for one answer, one solution. And I think it's actually 100 small things rather than one big sort of, let's sign this regulation. But the short answer is the public-private stuff, it's getting better. And I think it's going to start to accelerate as we go forward. I think the recognition is, if your industry falls, everybody goes down with them.
Yeah, I mean, there is no silver bullet, like you said, and I think the issue is we need to get past cybersecurity being a competitive advantage. Okay, we need to share it, or it's never going to go away, and we are all victims. I think there's a very polarizing thought process in terms of we were hit, we don't want to talk about it because we are sort of the unique element, when they couldn't be further from the truth. Or there's the thought of we're too small, we're never going to get touched, nobody's interested in us, which is also false. So if we can get everybody together, holding hands a little bit and sharing stories about how to be better at cybersecurity, ideally, at a minimum, it should be decreased as opposed to continuing to go up in terms of the number of attacks.
Yeah, I always say, look, there are more attackers than there are defenders. We have to be perfect. They only need to find one missing scale in the dragon's armor. We have ethical constraints. They don't. And they have a lot more time. And we're always going to be backpedaling a little bit, I think, as defenders. And, we've seen things like zero trust, and I think that's an interesting model. And I just feel like we still need to do the basic blocking and tackling. And our report just shows an indication. A lot of people they're not patching. They're not shutting down their ports. They're not managing credentials. There's an attack. It's called an ATO. It's an account takeover. And if you use the same username and password at work as you do for your bank, as you do for Gmail or whatever, well, those credentials are out there. And if somebody gets them, then they're going to start doing something called credential stuffing, which is taking all the username and password pairs and shoving them in everywhere they can find them. And that, like basic blocking and tackling, looking at things like the Center for Internet Security Critical Controls, looking at MITRE ATT&CK, looking at NIST CSF, and just going like, what is it we can do today? And then what is it we need to do, in 6 months and a year, and take a more strategic approach. I think we need to do a better job of embedding what we do in business decisions. And for those of your listeners out there that are publicly traded, there's new SEC regulation coming that you need to have cyber expertise on your board of directors. So they're going to start asking more questions. And as we've seen with historical SEC regulation, that stuff typically finds itself into the private sector for companies that are not publicly traded because it's pretty well thought out. So I think we need more synergy between business and technology risk. And I don't think a lot of it's there now.
No, I wasn't aware of the SEC dynamic. That'll be very interesting to see how that sort of morphs into other areas. One last kind of high-level topic I'd love to get your input on. Everybody obviously is talking about artificial intelligence right now. It was a huge topic before ChatGPT when it came to cybersecurity, but now it's just blowing up even more. My thought is it should be, if it can help the bad guys, it should be able to help the good guys too. But there are some that are a lot more concerned about the potential long-term effects of using AI for hacks. Where do you stand? What are your thoughts?
So I've been doing a presentation on AI and cybersecurity in some way, shape, or form for the last couple of years. And I always tell people there are 3 things you want to look at. Number 1, your business is using AI to make themselves bigger, better, faster, more. They're buying platforms that are using AI. They're investing in tools that are using AI. So that's one piece. The second, exactly your point, the attackers are using AI. And as defenders, we are being inundated by vendors that say they use AI. And some of them do. But you got to ask 3 questions. And I have to give credit to my former colleague, Mark Horvath, for this. He said, ask your vendors this. What do you do that you couldn't do before? What do you do better? And what do you do that your competitors don't do with AI? And if they can't answer those 3 questions, you should probably start doing a deeper dive. There are a lot of really, really cool AI capabilities coming out. I was at a conference in Minneapolis 2 weeks ago, and the CISO for Mandiant, which is now part of Google, was there. And he did 45 minutes on AI, and he focused more on the attacker and the defender. But Google, as an example, they have a bunch of really cool stuff coming out to help people analyze attack patterns. So you have this massive amount of data, and they can help you facilitate that. They're looking at being able to create attribution for where the attacks actually came from. There's some really, really cool stuff out there that I think will get into the hands of the defenders. And let me tell you, the attackers are using it. We better also be using it. Otherwise, they're operating with a full suite of tools, and we are man with a hammer thinking every problem is a nail.
Great point. Before we kind of close things up here, Jeffrey, when we look at the next 12 to 18 months, I mean, we've talked about AI, we've talked about some of the legislative efforts that are in place. Are there any other big trends that you think might kind of dominate the cybersecurity landscape when we look to the near future?
Yeah, so I think the biggest one that's still there's a great amount of uncertainty is what's going to happen with the economy, right? I've been around a long time. This is the weirdest economy I can remember. Because some of the indicators say we had a recession and we're better. Some say we are still in it. Some say we haven't even gotten there yet. So I think the financial focus on that, I think, is going to be a challenge, because if we as security and risk practitioners can't justify the value of what we do, they're going to take money away from us, right? So that's one. I think the AI, I think that's going to be a huge thing. And I think ChatGPT was a paradigm shift, represented a paradigm shift. Because now a lot of people that didn't have access now have access. I think the ransomware landscape is going to continue to evolve. The gangs are getting better, bigger, and we are, in a lot of cases, standing still. I think regulation, is always a little bit of a catch-up. What we're starting to see in the regulatory environment is at least regulations are being created by people that at least have some understanding around technology, whereas in the past, they were just writing legislation with no real understanding. I think that We're starting to see a lot of consolidation in the cloud, and the cloud is going to be the norm if it's not already. And hopefully the bigger cloud providers can help with a lot of the security. And then I think one of the biggest things is going to be the board awareness, and having security and risk leaders and architects and engineers be able to articulate in business context, why these things are important. You can't go in front of a board and say we're missing 80,000 patches. You can go in front of a board and say there's a thing we do, and if we don't do it well, we're much more likely to be hit. We have a couple different levels at which we can invest. Let's talk about what's aligned with what your risk appetite is, and then we can invest appropriately. And I think that's a really powerful tool, and we're definitely starting to get there. And really big companies are already doing that. I think it's starting to float down. And the beauty is that even small companies, Jeff, can actually avail themselves of a lot of these practices, right? Because their risks are still aligned with the investment. And that is a lesson that I think we can teach them. And automation, I think, is a key to the future. Human beings are inherently bad at identifying patterns. We see them when they don't exist, and we miss them when they do. So that's where AI and that's where automation comes in, being able to cut down background noise and parse out a lot of the sort of irrelevant data, so that humans can then step in and say, okay, this is actually something that's a big problem that we need to pay attention to.
Awesome stuff, Jeffrey. I can't top anything you just said. I agree with 100% with all of it there. Your podcast, again, what's the name in case people want to check it out?
It is called Risk and Reels. And basically we talk about movies for 5 or 7 minutes. And then we talk about cybersecurity. And we've had some really, really fun guests. So yeah, I would love it if people checked it out and let me know what they thought. I'm really enjoying doing it. That much I do know for sure.
Thanks, Jeffrey. And for more information on the work Black Kite does, you can check them out at blackkite.com. Thanks for joining us today. And to catch up on past episodes, you can go to manufacturing.net, IEN.com, or mbtmag.com. You can also check Security Breach out wherever you get your podcasts, including Apple, Amazon, and Overcast. And if you have a cybersecurity story or topic that you'd like to have us explore in Security Breach, you can reach me at jeff@ien.com. For Jeffrey Wheatman, I'm Jeff Ranke, and this is Security Breach.